Thanks for downloading a 3CR podcast. 3CR is an independent community radio station based in Melbourne, Australia. We need your financial support to keep going. Go to www.3cr.org.au for more information and to donate online. Now stay tuned for your 3CR podcast.
But you also had people that were very fine people on both sides.
And the aliens would mind meld and give them the technology. They're bad aliens. So are you surprised the Nazis were influenced by demons?
No, if demons are real, I would definitely think they'd be on the side of the Nazis.
Yeah.
McDonald's is connected to the Clintons. They chop up the bodies and put them into the sausage and hamburgers. People are being cannibalized. Look it up.
And I'm watching CNN talk about this as violent white nationalist protests. We have done everything in our power to keep this peaceful, you know?
It's Pepe's become kind of a symbol.
Welcome to Na Pasaran, a show about fascism and its gravediggers. I'm Cam Smith.
I'm Andy Fleming.
And this week we're joined by Dr Fran Amery, who is a senior lecturer in politics at the University of Bath. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Could you tell us a little bit about your area of research and what drew you to it?
Yeah, so, my background is doing research on feminist politics and sort of that intersection between feminist activism and political institutions, formal political institutions. And at the moment, for the last couple of years, I've been working on a project on transphobia in the United Kingdom in particular, which, as I'm sure many listeners know, has really, really taken hold here over the last few years.
Yeah, no danger of running out of subject material.
No, absolutely not.
You've recently co-authored a paper with Aurelian Mondin, friend of the show. It's called Othering, Peaking, Populism and Moral Panics, the Reactionary Strategies of Organised Transphobia. Could you tell us a little bit about what you were looking into there?
Sure. So what we really wanted to do with this article was, well, first of all, to show that what we call organised transphobia uses very, very similar strategies and tactics as the broader reactionary movement, which we would say that it belongs to. That itself is not a new observation in the slightest. Many, many people have pointed it out. But what we really wanted to do in this article is really drill down into what some of those strategies are. And there are kind of four things that we cover in the paper. So the first of them is the othering of trans people. So the portrayal of trans people as an other who can't really legitimately speak on behalf of themselves, rather their experiences need to be translated through the cisgender and, transphobic, supposedly majority. The second strategy is the role of moral panics, which we also connect to what the movement likes to call the peak trans moment, the moment of conversion into active transphobia, if you like. The third strategy is the use of so-called populist discourses, so the claim to be speaking on behalf of the people against some sort of nefarious transgender elite. And then finally, the fact that all of this ends up kind of pointing towards and justifying increased authoritarianism, the use of increasingly authoritarian politics and policies in order to get the supposed transgender threat under control.
In the article, there's reference made to organised transphobia as being, in a sense, produced by or conducted by powerful political forces at the top of society. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that.
So what we really stress in the article is that this isn't just a grassroots movement. It really likes to portray itself as a grassroots movement, and certainly it does involve certain activists, including radical feminist activists who very much could be described as grassroots activists. But really what we've seen in this movement is the creation of a very well-developed network of actors, which includes some quite powerful figures, many of them journalists with some of the major news outlets in the country, also politicians, and increasingly we're seeing links there with government, also figures within the medical profession, within the National Health Service, in particular in academia and so on. So as much as this is a movement that likes to present itself as some sort of grassroots, almost a spontaneous movement of the people, really it's anything but.
There's also passing reference made to the situation in the UK as opposed to the US. Do you have any observations about how organised transphobia manifests itself in these two different territories?
Yeah, so something that's a real peculiarity of the UK context is the extent to which, even on, I suppose, the centre-left in the UK, transphobia has really, really taken root. Whereas if you compare to the United States, if you look at things that, for example, even Joe Biden has said about trans rights and his nominal support for trans rights, at least, that is very, very much not the case in the UK. We even have politicians of the Labour Party, for example, who even a few years ago might have agreed with the statement that trans women are women, for example, now are starting to roll back on those kind of statements and to increasingly incorporate transphobic arguments into what they'll say publicly.
You wrote about peak trans in the article. Could you tell us what that is?
So peak trans in transphobic discourse, or especially in the discourse of the transphobic movement, essentially refers to the moment at which a person gets converted into being an active transphobe, an active member of this organised movement, this organised transphobia movement. And it's often portrayed as the moment where you've had enough. So often the narrative goes something like, oh, I was a liberal feminist, I believed in tolerance and equality, I supported trans people. But then I learned that trans people had gone too far, that they'd crossed some sort of line, whether that line is that you'd heard that trans women might be using women's bathrooms, or whether it's something to do with trans women competing on women's sports teams, whether it's something to do with children getting access to gender-affirming treatments. You realise that trans people have crossed some sort of line, and then supposedly that's the moment at which you convert into a member of the transphobic movement.
Fran, one of the points that is made in the paper is that you want to resist individualising transphobia and argue that it's important not to focus too much on the views of particular individuals within this movement. Can you elaborate on why you make that argument?
Yeah, I mean, I sometimes worry that focus on particular individuals becomes a bit of a distraction from the wider problems that we have here, especially as it can very easily devolve into an argument about whether this person is or isn't transphobic, or is this person far right or fascist, or aren't they? Should we be applying the label TERF to this person or not? Which is not always necessarily helpful. I think it's more helpful to look at what the discourses are and the role those discourses actually play, what their function is. So I think a good example of this is the CAS report that was recently published. This is a long-awaited report into the state of gender-affirming care or any care available to transgender youth in the UK, and how it's applied by the UK's National Health Service. So this review is headed up by a woman called Hilary Cass. There's been a lot of discussion of, is Cass transphobic or isn't she? Should we be calling her a TERF, a trans-exclusionary feminist? And it's kind of a complex one, because on the face of it, if you read elements of the report, some places and some of her interviews as well, Hilary Cass seems to be sympathetic to trans people. She will say things like, oh, gender-affirming care is very important. It's important for trans youth to receive treatment. The use of hormone treatments is really beneficial for trans people. And she'll sometimes talk about the polarized debate and how that's very harmful to trans people. So she'll appear to be sympathetic to trans people. She won't necessarily, at least, appear to be somebody who agrees with the most extreme elements of the transphobic discourse that we've been seeing bubbling up all over the place here in the UK. But actually, at the end of the day, she has produced a report which, on very, very questionable grounds, has ended up dismissing a lot of the internationally respected evidence that we have supporting trans healthcare as supposedly not being good enough. And this is a report that is going to be used essentially to further restrict, first of all, the ability of trans youth in the UK to access healthcare. It's going to justify changes that senior figures within the NHS have already wanted to make as regards restricting access to that healthcare. It's already being trumpeted all over the press as a report that's showing that the evidence base for transgender healthcare is very thin, which it in fact isn't, and it's already being set up as something that's going to provide justifications perhaps for further restrictions on adult trans healthcare down the line. So I think it's really important not to get too embedded in questions of, does this person personally agree with transphobic views or far right views, but rather look at what's actually being produced as a result of this, and what is it doing? What is it supporting?
Speaking of the TERF label, it often is applied to people who are not especially feminist in any way. Could you tell us a little bit about how some feminists find themselves connecting with people whose views, I guess, are anti-women more generally?
So there are kind of lots of different factors here. It's really difficult to kind of pull them into any sort of coherent thread, but I'm going to give it my best effort. So I think there's kind of a lot of roots into this kind of activism for a lot of people. So we know that there are some women, some feminists, those who were kind of originally assigned the label TERF, trans exclusionary radical feminist, and probably most accurately assigned it because they are radical feminists who exclude trans women from their feminism. And I think for them, there's often, not for all of them, for a lot of them, been a sense of kind of being disconnected from, first of all, from more mainstream or more inclusive variants of feminism, and sort of needing to make alliances elsewhere. And that's certainly not actually necessarily a new phenomenon within feminism. We've seen it in more historical campaigns against pornography, for example, or concerning sex work, that you see feminists, often radical feminists, forming or entering into quite challenging and difficult alliances with conservative or even further right actors. So first of all, I think the first thing I say is there is a history of this. I think some of those kind of alliances already existed to be taken advantage of, or perhaps some people within the movement kind of looked at some of those alliances and perhaps thought that there is something there to emulate. So that's one route in. I think another route in really is that actually a lot of people, the people who are now quite active in the anti-trans movement, weren't necessarily particularly active feminists or people who particularly knew a lot about the feminist movement or the history of feminism to start with. And I think perhaps when you've been sort of radicalized in that way, it becomes a bit more difficult to see some of the dangers of those sorts of alliances. I think particularly in a British context, I think there are perhaps a lot of British feminists, I'd say probably white middle class British feminists in particular, who feel very secure in the belief that actually any kind of more dangerous rollback of women's rights is quite unlikely to happen in the UK. So they may believe we might be very unlikely to lose abortion rights, for example, despite the fact we don't really have them in the UK, that we may be very unlikely to lose what access to abortion we have. So therefore they feel perhaps very comfortable in forming alliances with actors who are quite anti-abortion.
I suspect there were quite a few people in America who thought they were unlikely to lose abortion rights as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Fran, for some, I guess what you've described in some sense as being a kind of moral panic around issues to do with transgenderism and so on, it can occur to some that it's a kind of existential crisis, such as the nature of the threat being posed by the assertion of rights to healthcare and so on by transgender people. Do you think that's also an element that kind of propels people to take quite illiberal or other approaches that seem to be, I guess, in conflict with other values?
So if I understood the question right, do you think it's the way the nature of the supposed trans threat is being portrayed is what leads people into taking very authoritarian?
Yeah. And I guess I wonder, in that context, how that relates to broader questions of democracy and liberalism and populism.
Yeah, I think a big part of it is, I suppose we need to think of it in terms of exceptionalism. So people might in general hold or think of themselves as holding very liberal and tolerant values. But we know that even within those kind of belief systems, it's possible to have little pockets of exception. So people essentially who you think perhaps those beliefs don't apply to, or those beliefs shouldn't apply to. So there's some really, really interesting anti-racist theory around this as well. The idea that a white racist transgenderists, for example, might think of themselves as a good person, a morally upstanding person, and a progressive person, but they don't see people of different races as kind of entering into the equation and sort of deserving those same considerations. So I think this is in part a reflection as well of the extent to which trans people have been othered in popular discourse, the idea that trans people are perhaps people who can't really be trusted about what they say about themselves and their own experiences. They're not people who we should be treating as authorities on their own experiences. They're perhaps people who need some sort of best paternalistic figure to guide them back towards the right way of being. So yeah, I think it's the extent to which trans people are othered, and I'd also say infantilized as well, that almost sort of leads people to think that actually they are, in fact, still being liberal and progressive, even when what they're proposing are actually very, very authoritarian policies. And I think that is, in fact, often the case that in liberal democracies or so-called liberal democracies, that often you see authoritarian policies are being promoted or are being implemented, they're often paradoxically kind of justified in terms of liberalism, in terms of, okay, this person needs our help so that they can properly be free, or they can be free in the right way, because actually what we're doing is freeing them from, say, transgender ideology or something like that.
Fran, in Australia, for over the past few years, there's been a rise in anti-trans activism, and behind it there seems to be, I guess, an unspoken, for a segment of it at least, an unspoken religiosity driving it, as well as a strain of conspiracism. I was wondering, in the UK, where I guess it's a lot more mainstream, there's a two-parter. Is there a strain of religiosity driving it, and how does conspiracism fit into anti-trans activism in the UK?
Yeah, so on the first question, again, I think this is an area where it's really helpful to think of the transphobic movement in terms of a coalition between very different actors, because absolutely I would say that the majority of figures and organizations that we tend to associate with this movement really aren't religious actors. They're often quite avowedly secularist. In fact, there's been some interesting arguments some people have made that actually have linked some of the key anti-trans figures, especially within journalism, to the skeptics movement, a movement of people who were perhaps very pleased with themselves for being atheists, and people who didn't believe in homeopathy, things like that. So while I certainly wouldn't say that kind of the majority of figures in the movement are religious people or people with religious beliefs that are informing their anti-trans positions, there certainly are also figures in the movement who are, perhaps in a more or less kind of shrouded way. It's maybe not something that they'll generally draw too much attention to in their discourse around trans people. Rather, they'll shroud it in things like the idea of freedom of speech, for example. So we've had a case of a Christian teacher ended up getting in trouble at work for refusing to use a trans student's pronouns, and this was entirely on the basis that he believed his own religion prevented him from doing so. But of course, in all of the reporting, the legal case that surrounded this, it's been very much presented as a freedom of speech issue. So yes, religious actors are there. I wouldn't say they're the bulk of the movement necessarily, but they certainly are present. And the other thing that I think we can't discount is the extent to which even more secular and more supposedly moderate actors on the UK side of things are still entering into alliances with kind of covert alliances with Christian right figures, especially in the United States as well. So looking at organizations like the Heritage Foundation, for example, they very much do have links with UK anti-trans organizations. Remind me what the next question was, something about conspiracism?
Oh, yeah. To what extent does conspiracism inform some of this stuff, I suppose?
Yeah, I mean, it really does. And it's actually been quite overt, I would say. So a big theory that is pushed by the transphobic movement in the UK and elsewhere has been the idea of what they call trans policy capture or trans institutional capture, which essentially is the idea that what they call transgender ideology, or sometimes just gender ideology, which is a term that's used all over the place, obviously in anti-gender movements more broadly. But the idea is this kind of pernicious trans ideology has slowly crept into and infiltrated our institutions, infiltrated policy making, and taken it over. And that very much connects, of course, to that use of populist rhetoric, the idea that actually transphobia aims to protect the people against a nefarious and shadowy elite. So yeah, I would say conspiracy theory is all over the place in this idea that trans activists or trans ideology have kind of captured all of our political institutions and we need to take them back. But it's very, very rarely identified for what it is, even in more critical works on more critical discourse and transphobia in UK public discourse.
Fran, the UK is due to have a general election later this year. How has organised transphobia and transphobic sentiment informed political campaigns so far, and how is the subject, I guess, treated by major parties within the UK?
Yeah, it's had a big impact so far, and it's likely to, unfortunately, to continue to have a big impact, and probably to worsen quite a lot in the months running up to the election. So transphobia is very much something that the Conservative Party is using as a distraction from what I'd say are the real issues affecting the majority of people in the country at the moment, things like the cost of living crisis, the fact that the NHS is essentially crumbling around us, is not able in any way to meet the demands on it. So transphobia in a way is a very, very useful tool for the Conservative Party to say, oh, at least we know what a woman is, or at least we're trying to protect children from unnecessary medical treatments and surgeries and whatever. So it's a useful tool for the Conservative Party to distract from the real failings that we've been seeing under their watch. Unfortunately, however, transphobia has become so embedded really in UK public and political discourse that we're barely seeing any kind of pushback on this. So instead, what we're seeing is actually figures within the Labour Party, so the party that's likely to be in government after the next election, actually rolling back what were in the first place, very, very kind of milquetoast, kind of lukewarm statements in support of trans people and the trans community. Even those are seemingly being rolled back. There has been very, very little in the way of critical response to the Cass reviews report that I mentioned earlier. Rather, again, you have Labour Party politicians welcoming the report and saying, yes, we're going to implement these recommendations will be implemented in full under a Labour government. So there's very, very little pushback. There's been a tiny bit more within the Liberal Democrats, which is the third biggest party in the country, but even then, not very much. And really, all major political parties have been facing huge divisions over this issue, and party leaderships have been very, very reluctant to sort of take any kind of action to address transphobia within their own ranks. So what we're likely to see in the election is the Conservative Party continuing to ramp up its transphobic discourse in the hope that will at least be a vote winner for them, and the Labour Party essentially not wanting to rock the boat too much, because I think they're hoping to present themselves as the reasonable party, which means, for some reason, the point we've got to in British political discourse is that being the reasonable party means not trying to overtly challenge transphobic views too much. So essentially, Labour is being pushed more and more towards a transphobic position, and it seems, to be honest, very unlikely that they're going to be able to steer away from that even after winning the election. So I'm, at the moment feeling fairly pessimistic about formal politics in the UK at the moment, should we say.
I'm no political strategist, but it seems like a pretty easy slam dunk to say, why are you talking about someone in the women's bathroom when we've got pensioners eating cat food or whatever? Like, sort of wrap itself.
Right, and they have some of the most egregious examples. There has been a tiny bit of mild pushback from the Labour Party. So when Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, made a transphobic remark in Parliament on a day that the mother of a murdered trans teenager was actually in the gallery in Parliament, we did see a bit of pushback from Keir Starmer, the leader of the Labour Party, but that's about as far as it goes. It's calling out only the most egregious, most hateful, horrible things, but and even then only in very, very limited occasions and only in the mildest possible ways.
Fran, you recently wrote another paper in the Journal of Diversity and Gender Studies about the ways that children are invoked in gender critical, in quotes, rhetoric. Could you tell us a little bit about what you found when you looked into that?
Yeah, so I was interested there in both, I suppose, the discourses being used by the movement, specifically concerning children, but also by the strategies they were using. So a core part of their belief, which I think is something that needs to be understood as it informs all kind of so-called gender critical activism and campaigning and lobbying concerning children, is essentially that they don't believe that a trans child can exist. So that's the core belief that sort of informs all of their actions there. That belief informs essentially how they portray education in particular as perhaps a dangerous site, a dangerous location for children. So there is this idea that since trans children cannot legitimately exist, that children become to believe they are trans through a process of social contagion. So some of you listening might have come across the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria. And essentially, this is a theory that says exactly that children are coming to believe that they are trans, mistakenly believe that they are trans through a process of social contagion. Now, the article where this theory was put forward had massive problems with its methodology. It was based on a survey of parents who didn't support their child's trans identity or their children or their transition. So, I mean, it should have been obvious that those kind of parents were going to claim that their child had suddenly become trans and it wasn't a genuine identity, right? But nonetheless, this belief in this theory very much informs lobbying around this issue. And in particular, the fear is that educational institutions, so schools, also online as well, but in particular schools, are one core site where this sort of contagion of trans children is happening. And that very much informs the movement's strategy as regards education. So there has been essentially a strategy of trying to prevent education from acting as this site where children supposedly get exposed to so-called transgender ideology and as a result become trans. So there's been an attempt to, I suppose, change the educational environment in two ways. So one of them has been directly by targeting trans children's ability to, I suppose, exist as trans children in those spaces. So trying to push back on schools allowing trans children to change the name that's used for them in classroom or to change the pronouns that are used for them, things like that. But there's also been fairly sustained attacks on kind of educational and inclusion materials that might be used in schools to essentially educate children about the existence of trans people, what it means to be trans, things like that. So there have been a lot of campaigns targeting local authorities and trying to get them to withdraw the use of trans inclusion materials generally produced by LGBTQ plus organisations and used in schools. So as a result, these campaigns have managed to get a lot of local authorities in the UK to withdraw the use of those materials. So that's been one core part of the strategy, is essentially targeting educational institutions, trying to change their policies, trying to seek the removal of trans-inclusive educational materials. And another core part of the strategy has been the recruitment of parents into the movement. So parents have really been recruited in two ways. On the one hand, they've been recruited essentially as proxy lobbyists for the movement, as people who are very well placed to reach out to their own school, to start questioning their own school's practices and policies. And some of the websites of organisations within the movement, they have guides for parents on things like how to write a letter to your child's head teacher, or how to submit a freedom of information request, things like that, how to get hold of the policies or the educational materials that your school is using. But the other way that parents have been recruited is as what I essentially call agents of gender discipline within the household. So the movement is at the same time as targeting schools, it's also trying to recruit parents, especially parents of trans children claiming a trans identity, and essentially arming them with ways that they can try to encourage their child to desist from expressing a trans identity by, for example, exposing the child to materials that kind of undermine that sense of identity, or exposing them to sort of scare stories about what might happen if they persist with the trans identity. Or just by trying to kind of put them off. So something that struck me in one of the documents I looked at was advice to parents who are being asked by their child about the possibility of accessing gender-affirming care, for example, or even just sort of changing their name or pronouns. Parents are advised to say something like, let's get you through your driving test first, so to try and just postpone the decision in the hope that eventually it'll resolve itself.
Are there people involved in this that are involved in the therapy business? It seems like it might just be trying to shore up some work down the track.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And there's been really, really fantastic research by some kind of trans research groups or trans activist groups, really highlighting the extent to which I suppose these organizations promote conversion therapy and essentially work with conversion therapists and conversion therapy groups as well.
Oh, right. I was just sort of joking.
Unfortunately, the links are very real.
What you've studied in these accounts of what in a sense amounts to the corruption of youth, is there also an attempt to explain why this is occurring and who are the agents responsible for it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so one thing that really jumped out at me when I was researching these what I call child focus groups, so the groups sort of lobbying around education and child access to gender affirming care and things like that, was the extent to which their documents, and these are big kind of massive resource packs that they send out to schools, as well as shorter documents aimed at parents and recruiting parents as well, the extent to which they, as well as taking aim at trans-inclusive materials, they take aim at sex education and make links between the two, but also in doing so make links between what they describe as a dangerous male sexuality, like a pornographic sexuality, and trans identity. So I think those kind of links, they're not spoken about enough. I think there are some really, really strong links between so-called gender critical and anti-porn feminisms. There aren't necessarily links there. There certainly are anti-porn feminists who aren't transphobic. But I think those links are really, really strong, and they really, really explain why this is such, to some gender critical feminists, why this is such a scary issue. Because essentially, what they're arguing when you cut away everything else is that there's something innately sexual or even pornographic about trans identity, and that trans identity is essentially something that what they would call porn sick and patriarchal men are sort of trying to force both on women and on children. And I think that forms a core part of why they don't believe that transgender children can legitimately exist, because they think trans identity is fundamentally sexual, is fundamentally pornographic, and that innocent children couldn't legitimately have that kind of identity for themselves.
What resources are available in the UK to those who want to resist organised transphobia?
Good question. So there are some really, really great groups trying to push back against it. I'd really like to highlight the work of a group called the Trans Safety Network, who've done absolutely fantastic research into these groups, into the arguments they're putting forward, but into the kind of connections that they have, both with the far right, but also with authority figures. There's some really, really fantastic investigative journalism they're doing, which does not make it into the broadsheets. It barely makes it into mainstream news reporting whatsoever, and it really, really should. So first of all, I would very much encourage anyone interested in these issues to go and have a look at some of the reports they've written. I think as well it can be helpful to organise locally and to do what you can, because something I've realised is that I think it's going to be much more difficult. I'm not saying they can't do it, but in organisations where there is a much more, I suppose, pro-trans culture, it is going to be much more difficult for the anti-trans movement to root that out. They've been very successful with the government, for example, and in institutions that were already kind of receptive to some of those beliefs. But there are huge sections of society that we know very, very strongly reject transphobic views as well, and they aren't easily going to be convinced just by the fact that sort of news is reporting whatever, or the CAS report has come out with whatever, because we're often talking about people who increasingly, especially with increasing trans visibility, no trans people have trans loved ones and aren't going to have their minds changed that easily. And so I think actually trying to build some of that culture locally is going to be really, really important. So doing what you can within your local community, within your workplace, things like that, to try and resist, even on a small level. I mean, it's not in the short run obviously going to change the really awful kind of big political picture that we're dealing with right now. But I think if we have enough people taking those kind of actions locally, it's still going to help. And I think it can also, I think, on a personal level, just help without it. It's been very easy, I think, to feel quite defeated. I think reading the newspapers recently, especially in the wake of the CAS report, and I think taking those kind of small actions locally is a way to get a bit of a sense of, I suppose, personal power and efficacy back in the wake of these horrible things being reported.
Well, Fran, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for coming on. If people want to read more of your work, you are on x.com at Fran_Amery. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Well, Andy, that's our show. We'll be back next week.
Yep, we'll see you then.
Got 5 for the 5? The Reserve Bank of Australia is reimagining the $5 note, and we want to celebrate First Nations cultures. Tell us what theme you'd like to see on the new $5 note. Submit your idea at banknotes.rba.gov.au.
A 3CR supporter. Mayday all night.
Are you a night owl?
I'm not.
Burning the midnight oil?
Working the night shift?
Or just an insomniac?
For one night only.
All night long.
Talk Back with Attitude is taking your calls.
You've got to be kidding.
From 12:30 till 5 a.m. God. 7 a.m. I've just been corrected. That's, of course, if we survive.
From 12:30 a.m. to 7 a.m. Till we get tired.
May Day, Wednesday, the 1st of May.